was standing in water that barely reached his knees. When he stopped and looked straight down, not around, not at his team, down, at something in the river, the others thought he'd spotted a rock, or maybe a drop-off, so they called his name. He answered, calm, clear, like nothing was wrong. But he wasn't answering them. He was responding to something under the surface, something only he could see. No splash, no panic, no warning. He just disappeared. Right there in front of them. The official report called it an accidental drowning. But the men who signed that report never set foot in that river again. Before we continue, don't forget to like, subscribe, and let us know your location. Thanks. His name doesn't exist anymore. Not fully. In the surviving records, it's been reduced to a single initial and a rank, a Forest Service patrol log, summer of 1881. Handwritten, partially altered. He was a field ranger. 6 years of experience in river territory. The kind of man who didn't make mistakes in shallow water. His team had walked that same route for weeks. No incidents, no reports, until that day. Afterward, one man was gone. The report was rewritten, and the entire stretch of that river, quietly erased from every map that came after. The document that launched this story into serious historical discussion is not unusual because of what it contains. It is unusual because of what it refuses to say. At first glance, the 1881 patrol log reads like any other ranger field entry from that era. The date is written in a standard hand. The names appear exactly where they should. The patrol route follows the river boundary without deviation, and the first several lines deal with nothing more alarming than timber checks, campsite positions, and the overall condition of the trail. Standard, procedural, unremarkable. But halfway down the page, something shifts. The handwriting changes. A section of the original text appears to have been struck out and replaced, not erased, replaced, with language so deliberately vague that it does the opposite of what administrative language is supposed to do. Instead of clarifying, it draws attention. Instead of settling a question, it quietly announces that a question existed. What remains in the final version is a single line about unstable ground and hazardous water conditions. Below that, a note using the phrase water conditions inconsistent with terrain. Read that again. Water conditions inconsistent with terrain. Rangers in 1881 were practical men who wrote practical things. They recorded washouts, loose banks, sudden depth changes, flood debris, and fallen timber. They did not write in language that suggested the land, and the water had stopped agreeing with each other. That phrase, inconsistent with terrain, reads less like field notation and more like a carefully negotiated compromise, as if the writer had first put something else on the page, then been required to reduce it to the minimum that would hold up under review without inviting further questions. And there is physical evidence of that reduction. The spacing in that section changes. The tone drops several degrees colder than the rest of the report. The handwriting narrows. One full section of the original entry has been crossed out entirely and replaced with the shorter, safer version. If you look at the document as a structural object rather than just a text, it reads like a man trying very hard to finish a story. He had originally started telling honestly. No folklore category was attached to this page. No local superstition was cited. No ghost story label was applied. This was not entered as a tale passed between laborers around a fire. It was processed as a work incident, a patrol disruption with administrative consequences. That distinction matters enormously. The men involved were not dramatizing a legend or performing the kind of theatrical fear that shows up in diaries and letters. They were marking a patrol along a familiar boundary, and whatever interrupted that patrol was serious enough to alter a formal government record, but ordinary enough in appearance that it could still be buried under workplace language. That combination is exactly what makes this entry so difficult to dismiss. Before the river becomes a problem, the patrol has to be understood as genuinely unremarkable. These were not explorers entering unmapped territory. They were not adventurers looking for something extraordinary in a landscape that had never been examined. This was a defined assignment on a defined boundary that these specific men had worked repeatedly. Their job was practical and repetitive. Check for unauthorized timber cutting, follow signs of hauling activity, confirm trail conditions, and maintain visible presence near the sections of river where floating timber might be quietly moved without authorization. Repetitive work builds a specific kind of intelligence. It teaches a man the difference between what the landscape normally does and what it occasionally surprises you with. These rangers knew where the banks narrowed. They knew the crossing points that held firm and the ones that softened after rain. They knew which bends collected drift and which ran clean. They knew the mud depth in the soft sections and the gravel character in the hard ones. This was not knowledge they had to think about. It had become physical, instinctive, the kind of certainty that lives in your feet and your hands before it reaches your conscious mind. Wildlife in that section of river was equally predictable. Deer used the same approach points at the same hours. Small animals drank at the same bends. Bird activity followed patterns the patrolmen could anticipate almost passively. None of this was remarkable to them. It was simply the texture of a working day on familiar ground. Their camp structure reflected that familiarity, positioned back from the bank at a distance that balanced visibility, with protection from damp soil, tools placed in consistent order, firewood stacked away from wet ground. Communication between the men was kept short and direct, not because the territory was hostile, but because clean sound carries well in forest work and prevents unnecessary movement. When two men separated to check sections of the tree line, the third could usually locate both of them by voice or by the steady, recognizable sound of ordinary labor moving through the trees. Nothing in the available record suggests this particular stretch of river had ever produced a single unusual complaint. Before the summer of 1881, no missing patrol had been connected to this route. No warnings had been posted. No local trouble report had ever singled it out. If stories had circulated in nearby settlements and in river country, stories always do, they were either considered irrelevant to official work or kept distant enough from formal paperwork that they never reached the desk of the men who made assignments. As far as the Forest Service was concerned, this was a normal district. Not comfortable, perhaps, because forest patrol work in that era rarely was, but normal. That normality is what removes the easiest explanations. These men were not arriving at a place already charged with local fear. They were not primed to look for signs of something waiting beneath the surface. Their habits had been built by physical repetition and daily familiarity, not by story. When one of them judged a bank stable, he did so because it had been stable many times before under his boots. When they chose a campsite, they chose it based on what the land had taught them through experience. Not instinct, not superstition, but repetition. A familiar landscape stops being something you examine. It becomes something you move through. You step where you always step. You listen for what is usually there. The environment folds into the background of the body, and you navigate it without fully activating your attention. That is exactly why the first irregularity unsettled them so quickly. It was not loud. It was not theatrical. No one saw a shape in the water. No one heard a voice from the bank. What changed first was something smaller and infinitely harder to write down. The sense that one section of the river had quietly stopped following the same physical rules as the rest of it. So what exactly were the men seeing, and why was it so impossible to explain? The first irregularities were environmental, and because they were environmental, they were easy to argue with. A tired man can doubt what he thinks he has seen. He can blame the light, the hour, the fatigue that builds in the legs after a long patrol. He can attribute a visual oddity to inattention, or to the particular way dense forest shadows fall across moving water in the afternoon. The mind in a familiar place is not fully watching, it is pattern matching. And when a pattern breaks just slightly, the first instinct is to dismiss it rather than examine it. That instinct failed the patrol quickly, because the anomalies were not isolated. They were repeated, and they were witnessed by multiple men independently before anyone raised them openly. The first thing that drew collective notice was the stillness. Certain sections of the river had gone quiet in a way that could not be accounted for by the current upstream. Not frozen, this was summer. Not blocked by debris, there was no visible obstruction. Simply still in a manner that contradicted the water moving on both sides of it. The rangers would observe leaves and surface light continuing downstream, watch them arrive at a particular bend, and then notice that at that bend, the surface appeared to lose momentum without any physical reason for doing so. The water did not stop entirely. It only moved incorrectly, as though the visible surface and the actual current beneath it had decoupled from each other. The rangers did not say this in those exact terms, because they did not have that framework, but the accounts that were later reconstructed from their testimony suggest they were watching. Without the vocabulary for it, a body of water that appeared to be operating on two different levels at once. Then the reflections began attracting attention. In calm water, distorted or delayed reflections are not inherently alarming. Shadow diffuses them, wind disrupts them, depth changes the angle. But what the men began to describe, first in offhand remarks, then with genuine unease, was something different. A branch would sway above the water. Its reflection would lag behind the motion, by a beat too long to explain with ordinary optics. A man would move along the bank, and his image in the surface below would appear fractionally behind him, not leading, not distorted, simply delayed, as though the water was retrieving information from a moment that had already passed. One of the rangers reportedly refused to describe what he saw in his reflection in detail. He acknowledged it appeared different from how he was actually standing. He said nothing further about it. And that silence is almost more disturbing than anything a description could provide. The sounds came next. Forest environments produce continuous ambient noise, birds, water, wind through canopy, the small mechanical sounds of animals moving through undergrowth. Patrolmen learn to use that noise unconsciously as a kind of background, confirmation that the environment is functioning normally. Silence in the wrong place is not peaceful. It is a signal. These men had spent enough time in the forest to know the difference between the silence of a resting landscape and the silence of a landscape that had stopped for a reason. Near the sections of river that exhibited the visual anomalies, the ambient sound did not simply decline. It dropped below the threshold of what the terrain should have been producing. Birds that had been active moments before were absent. The water noise that ought to have carried from upstream arrived reduced, muffled in a way the tree cover alone could not account for. But the worst of it, the element that began shifting the mood of the patrol, from confusion to something closer to controlled dread was not the silence itself. It was what occupied the silence. Voices. Not clear voices, not words, not names. The accounts are careful about this, in the same way the accounts are careful about everything. They described the phenomenon without committing fully to its source. What the men reported hearing was something that occupied the frequency range of the human voice, tones and cadences that suggested speech, that had the shape of conversation, that responded to the pattern of their movement through the forest, the way a real voice responds to proximity, except there was no one there. Each time the patrol paused and attempted to locate the source, the sound would diminish, not cut off, not stop suddenly, but diminish in the way a voice diminishes as a speaker turns away or moves deeper into space. It did not behave like an echo. Echoes repeat the initiating sound. This repeated nothing the men had said. It maintained its own rhythm, which was the more unnerving quality of it. Some of the men began interpreting the voices as coming from beneath the surface of the water rather than from the trees. This is where the patrol record enters more difficult terrain, not geographically, but psychologically. Because once a group of experienced men begins placing the source of an anomaly not in the landscape around them, but in the landscape below them, in the floor of a river they have crossed dozens of times, the nature of their unease fundamentally changes. It stops being environmental, it becomes intimate. The sense that the water itself was making sound, was in some way responsive, altered how the men positioned themselves near the bank. They had previously worked right at the edge as the job required. Now they began leaving unacknowledged. Distance between themselves and the water line, not a stated rule. No one gave an order, but the behavior changed, and because it changed without being spoken, it carried more weight than an explicit instruction would have. No one was calling it anything yet. They were not naming it. They were not attributing it to any category of explanation, natural or otherwise. They were doing what trained practical men do. When the environment produces something they cannot process, they continued working, they stayed together, and they quietly began positioning themselves for a situation that none of them was yet willing to define out loud. The patrol moved forward along the river, and the river moved with them. Not in the direction water is supposed to move, but laterally matching their pace, offering the same visual inconsistencies at each new bend, as though the anomaly were not a fixed location but a condition that had attached itself to their presence. That shift, from a strange place to a strange presence, is the detail that turns this incident from an environmental oddity into something genuinely difficult to explain, and it raises the question that the patrol could not yet answer. the one that would not be answered at the crossing either. If the river could follow them, what exactly was it following them toward? The patrol did not break. That is the detail that deserves more attention than it usually gets. These were men with years in the field. They had worked through bad weather, wildlife encounters, equipment failure, and the kind of grinding physical difficulty that tests patience long before it tests courage. They understood the forest's capacity for disruption. They had learned through repetition how to absorb surprise without losing their operational shape. They were not, by any available evidence, men who spooked easily or abandoned their footing over a strange noise or an odd reflection in the water. And yet something about this stretch of river was eating through their composure. Layer by layer, the process was gradual, which may be the most psychologically significant thing about it. A sudden shock can be absorbed and rationalized. A man who sees something alarming in a single moment can convince himself of almost anything: bad light, fatigue, the compressed anxiety of a long patrol. But a slow accumulation of contradictions does something different to the human mind. It removes the exits. Each new anomaly confirms the ones before it. By the time the fourth or fifth irregularity has been witnessed, the rational defense has started to cost more energy than the unease it was supposed to contain. The reflections had continued. So had the voices beneath the waterline. And now a third category of disturbance had entered the patrol's experience. The depth. River depth in a well-known patrol area is not something rangers consciously monitor at every step. They know it. It is stored in the body, alongside all the other accumulated knowledge of familiar terrain. They know where the shallows hold at a consistent ankle-level crossing, where the channel deepens toward the center bend, where a man of average height can wade without difficulty, and where the footing turns uncertain. That knowledge is reliable. It is built by physical verification over dozens of crossings, seasons, and conditions. What the men began noticing was that their depth knowledge had stopped being reliable. Sections of river they knew to be consistently shallow appeared deeper when approached. Not dramatically so, not deep enough to prevent crossing, not deep enough to constitute a visible change from the bank, but deep enough that a foot placed with confident expectation met resistance and uncertainty at the wrong moment, as though the river had adjusted itself between visits, as though the floor had shifted down a fraction in precisely the places where a man would plant his weight. Without thinking, one of the rangers tested this directly. He approached a section he had crossed without hesitation on multiple previous patrols. He knew the depth at that crossing to be between 12 and 18 inches at high season, shallower in dry weeks. He placed his foot with the certainty of a man who has made the same movement dozens of times, and the bottom met him lower than it should have. Not a dramatic drop, not a collapse of the bank, just a few inches of absence where solid ground had always been before. He pulled back, he waited, he tested again. On the second attempt, the depth held as expected. He did not discuss this with the others immediately. That decision and the choice not to raise it at once is itself instructive. A man who doubts himself suppresses the evidence. A man who doubts the environment keeps watching. He kept watching. Later that same section of patrol, a second ranger mentioned without prompting that a stretch they had passed felt deeper than he remembered it. He did not use alarmed language. He mentioned it the way a man mentions something he expects to be confirmed, and moved past quickly. The first ranger confirmed it. The third ranger had not crossed that section directly, but said the surface had appeared to sit differently than he expected, lower in the channel, as though the water table beneath it had dropped or the bed itself had descended. 3 men, 3 independent observations, one conclusion that none of them wanted to reach out loud. The river was not behaving like a known quantity anymore. It was behaving like something that was aware it was being measured. That sentence sounds unreasonable. It is supposed to sound unreasonable. The rangers themselves would never have written it that way. They were men of a specific professional culture that had no room for that kind of language in a formal report. But when you follow their behavior rather than their words, the increased distance from the waterline, the reduced pace, the way they began checking depth before committing to each step, the behavioral record says what the written record refuses to. They were no longer treating the river as terrain. They were treating it as something that responded. This shift had a direct effect on the patrol's communication. The short, clean calls that had functioned as their primary coordination system became less frequent, not because they had agreed to reduce them, but because several of the men later indicated that the calls had begun producing a response from the water that made them uncomfortable, not an echo. They were clear about that. They knew what echoes sounded like in that forest. What they heard was something that carried the shape and timing of a response without containing any of their actual words, as though whatever was producing sound beneath the surface had learned the rhythm of their communication and was mimicking its form without its content. One of the men stopped calling entirely and switched to hand signals when possible. Another stayed close enough to the patrol line that verbal check-ins were rarely necessary. Both men later provided accounts that were roughly consistent with each other, which strengthens the possibility that their adjustments were genuinely reactive rather than mutually influenced. The most significant behavioral change, however, was the one that went unspoken the longest. The men had begun avoiding their own reflections, not consciously perhaps, or not consciously at first, but several later accounts include references to an unwillingness to look directly at the water's surface for extended periods. Peripheral awareness of the river remained high. Direct engagement with its surface did not. Some of the men explained this later by saying the reflections had continued to delay, to misalign with their actual movements, to present them with an image of themselves that seemed to be occupying a different moment in time than the one they were standing in. Looking at a reflection that does not agree with your position is not a minor disruption. It is a fundamental assault on the basic sensory contract between a person and their immediate environment. The world tells you where you are. Your reflection confirms it. When that confirmation becomes unreliable, the disorientation is not just visual. It is ontological. You stop knowing precisely where you stand. And for men who were about to reach a crossing point, that uncertainty was about to become more than philosophical, because the crossing was ahead, and one of them was going to stop in the middle of it and look down into the water with an attention so total, so complete and so calm, that the others would begin calling his name before they fully understood that something had already gone wrong. What made him stop? What did he see in the water beneath him that the others could not? The crossing was not chosen under pressure. That matters. This was not a desperate ford in bad conditions. Not an emergency passage with failing light and no alternative. The men approached this section of river with operational intention. It was a known point on a route they had used repeatedly. The crossing here was categorized in their field. Knowledge as reliable, moderate depth, stable gravel bed, clean current. It was not the most comfortable stretch of the patrol that day, but it was far from the most demanding. They had crossed here before. They expected to cross here again. They entered the water in their established order, spaced to maintain footing and line of sight. The first steps produced no unusual response. The river took their weight the way a known crossing should, firm bottom underfoot, current predictable against the legs, depth consistent with the mental map they were carrying. For perhaps 15 or 20 seconds, the crossing was entirely normal, and that normalcy may have been the cruelest part of what followed, because it allowed them to arrive mid-crossing before the situation changed. It delivered them to the most vulnerable point, deep water on both sides, forward and back equidistant, before the river decided to become something else. The ranger designated in accounts only as the stopped man paused in mid-crossing without warning. He did not slip. He did not stumble. He did not call out or make any sound that suggested distress. He simply stopped moving forward and directed his attention downward into the water at his feet, not glancing down, not checking his footing with the brief, visual confirmation any man makes on uncertain ground, but looking with the kind of focused, sustained attention that implies recognition, as though something had presented itself to him beneath the surface and he was examining it carefully. The others noticed within seconds. When they called to him, he answered, and that answer, the fact that he answered calmly and coherently, is part of what made the moment so immediately wrong. A man in physical difficulty does not answer calmly. Pain, imbalance, and sudden fear all register in the voice before they register in the mind. His voice registered none of these things. He replied with the tone and cadence of a man engaged in a conversation, pausing to acknowledge an interruption, without redirecting his full attention away from whatever was holding it. He was not speaking to his partners. The accounts are in full agreement on this. When he responded to their calls, something in the delivery made clear that he was acknowledging them, without being fully present with them. His words, which the surviving record leaves ambiguous, reduced to the notation that he spoke but that the exact words were not agreed upon, carried the rhythm of a reply directed elsewhere. as though he had heard the others and offered a brief acknowledgement. The way a man absorbed in an important task will answer a knock on the door without opening it. He was, by every available behavioral indicator, responding to something in the water. The man nearest to him in the crossing order began moving toward him. He later reported that within 2 or 3 steps of the stopped ranger's position, the footing changed in a way he could not clearly describe. The bottom did not give way. It did not turn to mud or shift geologically. What changed was the certainty of it. The concrete, reliable, weight-bearing quality of the river floor became something less than what it had been, as though the gravel underneath him was still present but was no longer committed to holding a man's full weight with conviction. He kept moving toward the stopped ranger. From the bank, a third member of the patrol called out with more urgency. He reported that the water around the stopped ranger appeared to be rising, not in a surge, not in a flood pulse, but in a slow, localized elevation that was not occurring anywhere else in the crossing. The current to the left and right of that position continued at its normal surface level. At the point where the man stood looking down, the water appeared to be gathering upward around him, not violently, with a kind of deliberate patience. A fourth account focused on the depth. The man who provided it said the channel beneath the stopped ranger appeared far deeper than the crossing should have permitted, not a foot deeper, not a manageable discrepancy that could be explained by a scoured section of the bed, a depth that suggested the bottom had ceased to exist at that precise point in a way that contradicted everything. The patrol knew about the geography of that crossing. He was standing in water that should have reached his upper shin. The surface was at his knee. The visible depth below him was irreconcilable with both. The reflection account came from 2 separate witnesses. Both reported independently that the image in the water's surface beneath the stopped ranger did not correspond to the position of the man above it. His body stood angled toward the far bank. His reflection appeared lower, not just a fraction lower, the way a disturbed surface redistributes light, but significantly lower, as though what the water was showing was not a reflection of his current position, but of a position he had not yet reached. The body above the waterline stood at one level. The shape below appeared to occupy a depth that the river should not have contained. He had not moved. He was still looking down. His voice, when one of the approaching rangers called his name a third time, was reported as completely calm, almost conversational. Was the specific phrase used in the reconstructed account. He appeared to be engaged, not frightened, not confused, engaged. The way a man is engaged when a familiar voice says something interesting, when something long wondered about becomes suddenly clear. That specific quality of calm, the absence of alarm in a man standing in an impossible situation, is the detail that remained with the surviving rangers long after everything else about the day had been officially reclassified and administratively buried. Men in danger show their bodies alarm before they can speak it. The voice tightens. The breathing changes. The words become shorter and more fragmented. None of that was present. He was calm in the way a man is calm when he has reached the end of a long search, as though whatever was in the water had answered a question he had been carrying without knowing it. The nearest ranger reached him and later said he placed a hand on the stopped man's arm. The stopped man did not respond to the contact, not in the way a startled person responds, not in the way a person absorbed in thought responds when touched. He registered it as information and set it aside. His focus remained total, directed downward, into depth that should not have existed. Then he lowered one foot, not both feet, not a fall, not a collapse, not the involuntary drop of a man losing his balance. He lowered one foot as a man lowers a foot when testing a step in a deliberate, considered movement that implied the existence of a surface below him that the others could not see. What happened next is the point at which the event splits into 2 versions that the official record refused to choose between, because neither version made the drowning any more ordinary. And the difference between them, which should explain everything, explains almost nothing at all. There are 2 versions of what happened next. One says he was taken. One says he stepped down. The official record chose neither. It chose terrain. In the version where he was taken, something beneath the surface of the crossing exerted a downward force on the stopped ranger, not a current in any hydrological sense, not the kind of pull that moving water creates at depth against a planted leg, but a directed, Specific force that drew him down from a fixed, standing position with a smoothness inconsistent with any known behavior of water. In the version where he stepped down, he descended of his own volition into depth that had no physical right to exist at. That location in that channel. A man walking a staircase that only he could feel, into a river that was showing the others only its ordinary shallow face. The distinction between these two versions matters enormously in the context of an ordinary drowning. Here it changes almost nothing, because both versions agree on the single most disturbing element of the event. He did not struggle. There was no flailing, no instinctive clawing for the surface, no backwards lurch of a man who has lost his footing in current. The motion was smooth. It was ordered. It had the character of a man moving through familiar space, descending in a direction that felt, to him, as natural as a step from a low bank onto dry ground. He went into the water the way a man goes through a door. The two men nearest to him lunged forward the instant he began to descend. The first reported that the surface of the water around the point where the stopped ranger had stood became suddenly difficult to penetrate with his hands. Not solid. He was careful about this. Careful in the way. Men are careful when they know that what they are describing is going to sound wrong no matter how precisely they say it, but resistant in a manner that exceeded what water should offer, as though the surface had developed tension specifically at that location, specifically at that moment, as though the river had already committed to the outcome and was simply completing it. The second man said the depth vanished. He reached the position where the ranger had stood and found nothing. Not a churning depth, not a turbulent bottom where a struggle had stirred up sediment, not even the footprint of a recent disturbance on the river floor. Shallows, clean, ordinary knee-depth shallows, where moments before the surface had appeared to rise and the floor had appeared to drop away into something unmeasurable. The contradiction of this is what broke the patrol's composure completely. A man had disappeared in shallow water. The depth that had apparently consumed him had immediately vacated. The resistance that had prevented his partners from following him down had vanished as though it had never been present. The river had, within seconds of the event, returned to a condition of perfect ordinary credibility, as though it had taken what it wanted and then closed behind itself so cleanly that even the physical evidence refused to cooperate with a coherent story. They called his name for an extended period. They searched the immediate bank. They probed the crossing and the downstream channel with the tools available. Nothing answered. Nothing was found. No body was recovered at the site. No torn clothing on submerged timber. No sign of the submersion struggle that would accompany an ordinary drowning in that depth of water. No evidence in the physical landscape of the crossing that a full-grown man had just been lost there. Only the fact of his absence, and the river, now running shallow and clear and entirely cooperative, offering no explanation whatsoever. The patrol ended at that crossing, not paused, ended. The men who remained withdrew from the route immediately and did not resume it. There is no record of a standard recovery operation being organized in the days that followed. No official search party was dispatched to the crossing site in the manner typically required after an accidental drowning in a patrol area. That operational gap is not explained in any surviving document. It simply exists as an absence in the record, the same kind of deliberate, careful absence that appears in the report itself. They did not go back because they could not justify going back, not to the river, and not to any version of what the river had done. What followed was institutional management, executed with the quiet efficiency of an organization that had decided the most important outcome was containcy. The original patrol report was pulled and replaced. The rewritten version reduced the incident to familiar administrative language: hazardous terrain conditions, irregular water, accidental drowning. The missing ranger was entered into the service record with a cause that preserved responsibility, his own, and prevented the Forest Service from having to account for why trained men had abandoned a known crossing for reasons they could not state in a document designed to be reviewed. The behavioral record was stripped from the written record completely. The standing posture, the calm voice, the downward attention, the anomalous depth, the resistant surface, the clean return of shallow water after the descent, all of it removed. What remained was a man, a river, a misstep, and a loss in the minimum construction required to make the incident legible without making it open. The map change that followed the rewritten report is perhaps the most quietly damning piece of evidence in the entire case. The specific river section associated with the incident was removed from subsequent patrol routing, not marked dangerous, not annotated with a caution that would invite inquiry, simply omitted, a blank space on a working map where a known and useful route had previously existed. Patrol lines were drawn around it without explanation. The crossing was not replaced with an alternative crossing nearby. The section was simply removed from the landscape of assigned responsibility, as though it had never been part of it. Once a section of a working landscape is removed from maps without explanation, memory divides. Officially, the place becomes an undesirable stretch of water, a terrain irregularity, a minor inconvenience in routing, nothing worth discussing in the open. Unofficially, it becomes the part no one is told to enter and no one volunteers to defend. These two versions of the same place coexist in the same institution without ever being formally reconciled. The official version satisfies paperwork. The unofficial version governs behavior. And in the long run, behavior always outlasts paperwork, because the area did not return to normal use. That section of river remained avoided. Long after the rewritten report had been filed and forgotten, local reluctance outlasted the specific men who had filed the paperwork. The place developed the kind of reputation that does not require frequent repetition to remain effective, the kind that settles into a community's collective navigation system as a quiet, persistent avoidance that nobody fully explains and nobody fully questions. No further official patrols were assigned through that specific stretch in any surviving record that treats the route as ordinary again. From the edges of local memory, later references appear occasionally. Voices near the water in sections where no visible person stands. Reflections that fail to match the bank or the body. Positioned above them. Small, peripheral, insufficient to force public attention, but sufficient, consistently, to preserve distance. Sufficient to suggest that whatever the 1881 patrol encountered had not resolved itself, simply because the report had been rewritten. Nothing was ever officially admitted. Nothing was ever resolved. The river was not named dangerous for the reason the men feared it. It was simply left with an administrative silence. Around it, paperwork that stopped short of truth. Maps that stopped short of that bend. And a practical observation recorded. Somewhere in the final, surviving notes that says more in 11 words than the rewritten report manages in its entire length. Certain sections of the forest remain unassigned without explanation. But here is the question that the river never answered, and the paperwork never asked. If the water could take a man so cleanly, with no struggle, no trace, no evidence, had it done so before? And were there others before 1881 who also simply stopped in the middle of the crossing and looked down?